Good evening, everybody, and welcome to week 7 of Behind the Mic. I'm your host, Jonathan Hodson, back with you for another chat with the Sportscaster. And of course, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to everybody out there who might be watching us here on ASTV tonight. Appreciate your time as always. We are live tonight for the first time, going live across the ASTV network, amateursports.tv, as well as YouTube, Facebook, and our Periscope page. Tonight, we have special guest Ben Steiner in with us. We're going to run a range of topics. We're going to talk, of course, about the World Juniors that started with a couple of games today. Canada starting tomorrow. The game is in progress right now, so we're going to touch a little bit on that tournament, and that will lead into one of Ben's specialties, which is youth sports, and a little bit more about the Canadian Hockey League and other topics ranging from alpine skiing to maybe a little bit about the National Lacrosse League. And of course, we'll learn more about Ben and get to know his career path and his journey in sportscasting. So once again, thanks for listening in and watching in. We have a little bit of a different format for you this evening. We're going to run straight through and hopefully not take all evening for you this evening, as we know it's Christmas night. So thanks for watching, and we're going to bring in Ben to start our chat. Ben, thanks so much for coming on.
Very happy to be here, and anytime to talk any amateur sport in this country is definitely a passionate topic of mine.
Absolutely, and you're one of the best to talk about amateur sports with all the things that you have a hand in across the different sports, and can't wait to dive into it. So where are you at for our chat tonight?
So I'm in Whistler, British Columbia. I was in Toronto and spent a couple weeks in Vancouver, and then came up to Whistler and just having a nice winter break here in BC, which is my home.
Nice. Well, of course, what everybody's probably talking about right now, the World Juniors started today, a day earlier than usual. They have to pack all the games into one rink this year, so they added one day on the front of the first round. And we have a couple of games today. Slovakia over the Swiss 1-0, and then Germany, Finland in progress as we start. Can you give us a little bit of an update on that Germany Finland game?
Well, last I checked, it was 5-2 for the Finns, and Tim Stützle for the Germans did score that second goal. He made it 3-2 at one point, and if the Germans are going to do anything in this tournament, it's probably going to have to come through Tim Stützle. And certainly there was a 2-on-1 there. He fired it into the back of net. So certainly he has something to his game. I think we knew that going into the tournament. But again, the Germans are shorthanded. They had 10 players unavailable for today's game because of the pandemic, which is a whole other story intertwined with the rest of the tournament. And the Germans are going to have a tough time in this tournament with the way things have gone. They have Tim Stützle, but he's coming back from injury. And of course, tomorrow they're up against the Canadian team, which is definitely overpowered.
Yeah, that's that I would say raw deal, but that's just kind of the world we live in right now. A tough card for the Germans, having to go without 9 or 10 players, as you said. But switching over to the Canadians a little bit, this team, billed by some, is a little bit of a super team with 20 and now 19 first rounders. Even after the injury to Kirby Dach, that team has a lot of firepower this year.
They certainly do. And I mean, sure, you lose Kirby Dach, your first line centerman, but who do you slide in but the second overall pick in Quinton Byfield? So it's really not that much of a step down in quality. You're going from an NHL player to probably an NHL player this year on the LA Kings. So in terms of an under 20 tournament, there really shouldn't be too much of an impact with Dach's injury. But it is unfortunate. And I feel for the kid as well, because of course, he had a bunch of chances to play in this tournament. He never got the opportunity to actually lace up the skates, and this was going to be his first time after an entire year in the National Hockey League, and he doesn't get that chance.
And he's a unique case, and I think that's part of why it resonates a little bit more with him going down with that wrist injury and not being able to play, is the fact that he's an established NHLer. Uh, and with the circumstances, with the NHL starting late, he actually lobbied his management in Chicago saying, I want to go and play in that tournament if I get a chance. And that's not something that is typical from somebody who's already established at the next level.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the other players who didn't go back to the tournament. You can look at Nick Robertson for the U.S. or Alexis Lafreniere for Canada, and they're not going back to this thing because they've got junior hockey in the rearview mirror. But for Kirby Dach, he had junior hockey well in the rearview mirror. He was playing against the best in the world last year in the NHL, but he still wanted that experience being a Canadian, growing up watching the World Juniors around Christmas time. He wanted that experience to play in that tournament and wear the Hockey Canada logo. And unfortunately, the one chance he does get, he gets injured in a pre-exhibition game.
I watched a lot of the early game today with Slovakia and the Swiss, and of course it's a very similar setting to the NHL bubble in the summer with no fans and just media, and they're doing the best they can with piping in noise and whatever. And of course, it doesn't take much for young kids to emotionally engage in the game. So I didn't notice personally that much of a difference in the TV viewing experience of the early game. By being a Canadian hosted tournament, how different do you think that experience is going to be when Canada plays Germany and there's going to be nobody in the building?
I think it's a massive loss to the tournament and the atmosphere surrounding the tournament. This whole thing, the World Juniors, is really built around the fans and the media attention that TSN has given it over the years to really build this World Junior brand. And that has really spurned a bunch of fans into following this tournament. There's not really another place in the world who follows the tournament like Canada does. Sure, Sweden, Finland, and Czech Republic, they have an eye on this thing, but there's no passion. They're not packing 20,000 people in an arena to watch teenagers. But that happens in Canada, and that was going to happen in Edmonton and Red Deer this year. Of course, just Edmonton now, but with no fans. And I've got to say, watching the pre-tournament games, even though they had all the same effects and all the same fake noise and stuff like that as the NHL bubble, it felt a little bit more soulless. And personally, I found it a little harder to stay attached to the game. I really don't know what it's going to be when Canada's playing. I think I'll probably be able to watch the whole thing. And I watched a lot of the Slovakia game earlier today with, of course, Kingston Frontenac's Martin Chromiak on that team. But I do find it a little more soulless than the NHL. I don't really know what the issue is there. Maybe it's just early in the tournament and the NHL was the playoffs, but we'll see how it goes. But I definitely think there's a lot taken away by not having fans at the World Junior Hockey Championship.
Well, I think what it was for me personally was I think everybody, when the NHL bubble started, that was the first time we had seen live hockey since this whole thing started. And I think there was just a clamoring to get anything live. And so a lot of people were willing to not make a big deal of the differences. And at least the one thought that went through my head when I saw the game today was kind of like, oh, well, this is the exact same thing as the NHL. So maybe we're not quite as giddy to just have hockey.
I think a lot of people like to think they're just as giddy to have hockey, but I think in practice we're really not, because while the last few months have been terrible by every standard, they haven't been a surprise. We've sort of been able to see this coming for a while, and we saw the success of the NHL bubble. We were all just really happy to watch that when that was a thing, and that was also coming off of a time of unknown and a time of a lot of nerves in a lot of people's lives. And sure, we still have a lot of nerves and a lot of nervousness, but we sort of know stuff about the virus and how to put things on. So there's not just there's not a magic behind it like I think there was around the Stanley Cup playoffs.
One thing I heard TSN talking about in their tournament preview show was one of the tangible factors of having no fans on the tournament is when Canada gets to play in that environment, and when they're playing a small nation and say they get up 2-0 quick and the building goes bonkers. That's a hard momentum for the opposition to try to push back against and try to stop that snowball going down the hill. And same thing in a rivalry type matchup. So I think that when we see Canada get going, we might see, as disappointing as it might be for fans, we might see a little bit more of a pure, straight up hockey competition, because I think a little bit of the emotion factor might be taken out of it.
I think that's definitely a possibility, but you also have to take a look at past tournaments. Like last year, back when the tournament was in Europe, Canada still played with a lot of emotion, and they didn't have the home fans. Well, having any fans definitely gives you some emotion into a tournament. Even without it, Canada's a good team. They're an uber talented team this year. And so even if it just comes down to hockey without emotion, Canada's going to come out on top because there's really no other team except maybe the Russians who can parallel the Canadians in pure talent.
I remember, I think it was last season. There was a couple of Victoria Royals WHL games out here on the island, and there was a big snowstorm that basically shut down Victoria for a few days. And there was 2 games that weekend back to back, and there was, I don't know what they said, 1,000 people. It was probably less, probably a few hundred people in the building, and Victoria is a very solid WHL atmosphere. And I remember something that sticks out in my mind. I remember a player being asked by the media how hard it was to get up for the game, and the player handled it well. But he looked at him, and it was kind of like, it's a game. We've been playing games in front of nobody our whole life. So I think that's probably what you're going to see.
Exactly. And I mean, you take a look at Canada's likely starting netminder in Devon Levy. He's playing in the CCHL with the Carleton Place Canadians. He didn't go to the NCAA as he had sort of planned. And so, like, sure, he's an NHL draft pick, but he's still playing in the CCHL in tiny, tiny, tiny barns across small town Ontario. So nobody's watching him play on a regular basis. So I think of all the tournaments to have a junior B goaltender in net, that's probably the one.
Yeah, and you talk about Devon Levi being in junior A, and he's now at Northeastern University. Hasn't had a chance to play yet, and that's a little bit of a tie-in to some of your background in what you do covering amateur sports. One of your major concentrations is Canadian university athletes. A major concentration on U sports, but also with one of your major projects, you do cover Canadians in the NCAA as well.
Yeah, so 49 Sports, I guess that's sort of where you were going with that one, is a website that I run with a number of people basically across the country where we cover Canadian university sport as well as some outstanding stories of Canadians in the NCAA. But really, we do have a focus on covering Canadian university sport, and we have correspondents all the way from UBC in British Columbia to Dalhousie in Halifax. So we're spread pretty well across the country. We travel when we can. Of course, this year there's no national championships or even seasons to travel to. But I was planning on going to Halifax for the U Cup hockey tournament before that was canceled. And I was in Montreal for the University Soccer Championships last year.
So where did that idea originate from?
I mean, it's actually a pretty funny story. So we went, a couple friends and I, we went to a bar in Toronto. I just sent him a text saying, like, I have this sort of harebrained idea about something I'd want to do. And so we went to a bar, and a couple of us were underage. We weren't really supposed to be in the bar, but we went upstairs, and here's these 3 teenage kids, like, just like going over a computer, trying to figure like something out to do. And we figured out that we wanted to cover university sport, and initially it was just going to be university hockey. But I made the point of I wanted to cover at least soccer. So why don't we try and make an attempt to cover everything? And by the time we left, we had the website set up, and at that point it was 49-sport.wordpress.com, and eventually we removed that wordpress.com and have 49-sport as we do today, covering university sport really from coast to coast.
So what does your job description look like, and what kind of opportunities has it brought you?
So I'm the managing editor of the website. I know some people call me the founder as well, but I wouldn't necessarily call myself that. I think it was more of a group effort, and to grow really took a lot of different people to kind of bring us to where we are today. But as the managing editor, I edit every piece that goes up on the website, just making sure that they all fit the sort of the spin we want, the story we want to tell, as well as any grammatical errors or anything like that. And then for myself and my own reporting, I've developed contacts across university sport in Canada to break news, whether it's regarding players or news, and report on that. And that's sort of my main thing. But during a season, I also write and cover games, whether it's game reports or weekly columns. Near the end of last year, I was doing a weekly column on everything in U Sports men's hockey.
And so, for a little bit more background, you're a sport media student right now at Ryerson University. And so, how does your schooling, how does that logistically fit with covering things for 49?
It actually goes pretty well hand in hand, because being at Ryerson, I'll speak in terms of last year when it was regular season and a regular school year. So I'm in Toronto. I'm minutes away from the Mattamy Athletic Center, the former Maple Leaf Gardens, where the Ryerson teams play, about a 20-minute walk from Varsity Arena, where the University of Toronto teams play, and then a 40-minute SkyTrain or so from York University, where their teams play. So you have three major schools all within reach. So you can cover a bunch of schools in a weekend. And of course, the athletes who are playing on these teams are also students. And so they've also got classes during the weekend. Maybe they can't play on a Tuesday night, but their games are on a Saturday night when I'm also free. So for me, the only thing that really took away was maybe I didn't spend as much time with my friends as a bunch of other people did. And maybe I don't get that regular university experience of hanging out with friends and going out to parties and stuff like that. Whereas I'm always at a game, usually behind a mic or holding a camera, or just scribbling away on a computer, trying to tell some sort of story and put words in some sort of order that makes them seem significant.
And there is another aspect to that as well that you alluded to when we were talking World Juniors, is you're a writer for the Kingston Frontenacs of the OHL as well. Talk to us a little bit about where that came from.
Yeah, so that opportunity sort of came out of my coverage for university sport and a bunch of my other things. They were looking for a content guy for their website, and I was there, and they reached out to me, and I happily accepted the job. And it's been a real honor to be a part of their organization over these last few months. I think it's been about 5 months now. And the people there have just been fantastic. I've been doing about 1 or 2 pieces a week for their website and online content, just telling the stories and opening a bit of the curtain on the organization, and especially the players. I know I have a couple stories that stand out that I think we can probably get to a bit later in the show.
Yeah, and I was gonna go down that lane anyway, because that is something that we have a little bit in common. I do some writing on the WHL for the hockey writers, and I've been doing that for about the same time as you've been with the Frontenacs, and that's been an interesting time to basically, for me, start my hockey journalism career in a hockey world that is almost basically not on the ice at the junior level. With the exception of this tournament, we have a little bit of real games to talk about. So, from your perspective, what's that been like, telling the stories of junior hockey and starting to do that at a time when there's no fresh content to talk about?
I mean, I'll be straight up. It's been tough, but I also have two great bosses at the Frontenacs who have really helped me think of ideas to tell about these players and stories to tell about these players. And we have had a few moments that sort of stand out. We had two players get selected in the NHL draft this year, so that was two pieces that we did on them. Players have started in school, so we did a piece on sort of their educational pursuits and stuff like that. And then Martin Kromiak, of course, who I mentioned before, he's at the World Juniors right now. So we'll probably do some stuff around that. Of course, I was looking forward to initially the season starting in November. That didn't happen. Now I was looking forward to the season starting in February. Of course, that was postponed just a couple days ago. So who knows whether we will get a season. I'm still hopeful that we'll get a season. And I know people are quite hopeful around the league as well. But right now with the state of Ontario going into lockdown, it's just a bit of a holding pattern.
Yeah, and I think that leads into um, really a theme that's important for any broadcasters, media types at our level is we always have to be creative, whether it's in finding stories or what's been one of the great things about your career is being creative about finding things to do and making your own opportunities. How important is that to be creative and to find ways to get reps and find ways to get your stuff out there?
It's certainly tough to do right now because sports are so limited, and for a lot of up and coming broadcasters, including yourself, you usually go to the smaller organizations or the smaller leagues and stuff like that, and sort of get your reps in there. So for you, it was calling baseball in Okotoks and Victoria. For me, it's been reporting on U Sports and calling games both at UBC and at Ryerson. So that's not there anymore. And really, the only leagues that are up and running are the big ones where you can't really just get your reps in unless it's at some sort of blog. And so I sort of considered going to maybe returning to the Canuck Way, which was a blog that I wrote at before to cover the Canucks when the NHL bubble came back. And it just didn't really suit my fancy. But then I sort of thought, what's something I'm passionate about? I took a bit of a bigger lens and thought, what's something I'm passionate about? Where do I want to go? In this industry, and I sort of decided that I want to cover the Olympic Games. And the Olympic Games aren't just sports that happen every 4 years; they happen across every season, every year. So that's why I've dove into ski racing. I'm doing a bunch of bobsled stuff and skeleton stuff now as well because I realized growing up in BC and experiencing the Vancouver 2010 Olympics, especially being in Whistler for a lot of the sliding and skiing, those were two sports that I had a passion for. So I started chasing that with the U Sports on the side, and maybe that can lead somewhere because my dream is to cover the Olympic Games for whatever national network is covering it at that point.
And something we talked about when we had Lisa Bose on was she had a chance to cover the hockey tournament in Vancouver in 2010, and she spoke the value of those moments. Yes, they're fun and they're a big party and all that, but those are vital moments to spur these programs on. And so, as someone who covers the Olympic sports more than the average person might, what can you tell us about what what the Vancouver 2010 Olympics did for those programs in this country?
Well, the Vancouver 2010 Olympics offered a whole bunch of new facilities to especially Canadian winter sports. But really, the capital for winter sport in Canada has been in Calgary, and it's still the facilities from the 1988 Olympics. And that sort of established Canada as a winter sport power. All the national sport organizations, except for a few, are in Calgary. Wind Sport and the Canadian Olympic Park are both in Calgary. So you have most of the real development tools for Canadian Olympic sport in Calgary. The issue is a lot of them are deteriorating. You have the bobsled track that's not usable anymore in Calgary. You have the ski jumps, which are too old to actually prove effective. And so everything's a bit spread out between Calgary. And fortunately, there is Whistler and Vancouver now. But for Vancouver, in terms of a legacy, it doesn't really affect winter sports because so many of the things were built with a community future in mind. you take a look at the Athletes Village. It's not like we have our best Canadian athletes living there right now. It's just a residential neighborhood. Same with the Richmond Olympic Oval. It's not the new headquarters for speed skating Canada. It's a community center. And I think when you take a look at how the Olympic Games are run, this is the right way to do things, is to convert things into community-based pieces of property. But it definitely does have a bit of a detrimental effect on Canadian sport, especially winter sport, with everything sort of spread out. But in terms of a legacy in Vancouver, there is one, but I think it is more sort of in the memories.
And so, what does the life look like for a lot of these athletes who are in the spotlight? As you kind of alluded to, they're kind of in the spotlight for 2 to 3 weeks every 4 years, and then the public consciousness kind of goes away from it, except for those who are really really into it. And so, what are some of the challenges that these athletes face in in the course of an Olympic cycle to keep their pursuits going?
I mean, a lot of it is just love for the game that they're facing, because a lot of them don't make any money doing this. And the only money they make is either they're good and they make prize money, or from sponsorships from Canadian companies, which is definitely hard to come by this year. And a lot of athletes are sponsorship-less, which has proved a bit of an issue. But as you said, people become experts in these sports every 4 years, but they happen year round. I don't know how many people would know that Brent Hayden was a part of the Toronto Titans Swim Club in the International Swim League earlier this summer, but they know that he won a bronze medal at the London 2012 Olympics. So and when he won the bronze medal, people were the biggest fans of swimming. But now they don't care. They'll care when he returns to the Olympics, but it's a bit of an issue with basically all of these Olympic sports that aren't sort of mainstream like hockey is.
And one of your big things right now is alpine skiing, as we may have alluded earlier. And you're filling up your Twitter right now with skiing content. What can you tell us about what's going on in that world right now?
So the alpine skiing is one of the sports that has managed to make it through the pandemic. They shut down in March, as everyone did, because nobody really knew what to do. But they started the season. They canceled a lot of the North American races in the U.S. as well as Lake Louise in Canada. But they've put on a season in Europe, and it's gone very well so far. They've been able to basically put on every race that they usually would. Of course, there's been a bit of delay and a bit of a hiccup here and there, but it's worked out, and our Canadians are over competing in Europe and doing quite well this year, despite not being home for months on end.
And I want to circle back to something that we're talking about near the top of the show when we're talking about youth sports that I want to touch on and make sure we don't miss. You talk about skiing managing to make it through the pandemic and stay operational. I wanted to talk about some of the athletic programs, the teams and the programs that haven't been so fortunate during this time. And on a couple of levels, let's start like we did with the Olympic athletes. So let's start at the athlete level and the personal level of just how tough this has been on those student athletes that you cover, not having their sports right now.
I mean, just as the Olympic athletes, with all the struggles they're going through, the student athletes are facing a big struggle as well, because for a lot of these student athletes, they haven't experienced a purely academic school year. Either they take a bit of a reduced course load to also do their athletics on the side, or school does take a bit of a back burner for a lot of people as well. So it is weird for a lot of these student athletes to just have school, really, other than the occasional Zoom session or practice with their team. But I know for a lot of them who I've spoken to, they've been practicing, but the practices just lack that bit of extra drive. And again, like the Olympians, you're doing it for the love of the game. But it's hard to really get up and get psyched in practice when there's not a game for a long time.
And when you expand that out to the program level, a lot of the operating budgets for these athletic programs They're not very big to begin with. So how much pressure is being non-operational putting on these programs, and is there any fear in different places about the ability to come through this?
There has to be a lot of fear. I mean, just earlier in the pandemic in the spring, we saw the Lethbridge Pronghorns at the University of Lethbridge. They cut both their men's and women's hockey programs, and they did so without really telling the players. It was just, okay, hockey's the biggest thing on the budget, and they cut that. So I think that's a worry that we're going to be seeing really across university sport, because at a lot of universities, students can opt out of specific fees, and one of those fees, unfortunately, is athletic budgets. And so if students who are all pretty much short on cash right now are opting out of those student fees, it's going to take a big blow to athletics. And it's doubtful to me that we'll see as many programs come back in every sport. I think we'll definitely see some more fold before we resume play.
Yeah, that's been tough all around. To one of those programs uh, that we might be speaking about, not specifically due to problem, but you broadcast for Ryerson Hockey. You've done work on the men's and the women's side. Does that correspond or feed into your academic side on the sport media program?
So all of our broadcasts on Rams Live, formerly known as the Rams Network, are student run. It's about a team of 20 people and 6 broadcast crew leads, a few of which do write at 49 Sports. I'll give a shout out to Rich Coffey. I know he's probably watching tonight as well, but he does give a weekly column at 49, and he's one of the broadcast crew leads at Rams Live. So that's something that is all sport media students, and we need a specific amount of hours to graduate called creative practice hours, and that's one way you can get them. But for me, it's something I love to do, and it doesn't feel like it's required. But it's a completely student run production, and I just love to be a part of it every week. Of course, I don't know whether I'll ever be back in the same situation, because just sharing pizza, sharing a bunch of food before the broadcast, and just really hanging out with your friends, and then you go live and everything's professional and ready to go. It's a 5-camera setup. It's a great broadcast that this crew puts on, and it's always a pleasure to be a part of it. But I would do anything to get back into that.
And how much experience do you have with behind the mic, behind the camera, I should say, behind the camera skills with the production side of putting on a show for someone like yourself on the headset?
So I do have a bit of experience in that. I didn't get a ton last year, which was my first year at Ryerson. But I did run both the main broadcast camera and some ISO cameras last year, in the corners especially, was something that I did a few times. But I also ran DDR and replay once. So I've done a bit of everything. And in class, we've sort of taken a bit of a chance at a lot of things as well. But unfortunately, this year without sports, it was something I was hoping to get into this year, was more of the behind the camera and production stuff. But unfortunately, that doesn't exist this year, although we have had a bunch of training in remote production softwares, one of which we're using tonight. But softwares like Degero, which a lot of the major companies use, and I know they're also using for the World Juniors.
And kind of the thought I had in my head was thinking about the connection that the different skills have to each other. And I was wondering about your perspective on it, having the wide range of experience that you do on the reporting, the writing, the broadcasting, the behind the camera. How much value does having different kinds of skills and being able to report stories and tell stories in the different formats, how much do they help each other?
I think they help each other a ton, especially if we're just to look at sort of the talent side of things, where it's reporting and then you step onto a broadcast. You're so familiar with the topic from reporting and vetting out a tip or a story, that by the time you get on a broadcast, it's almost second nature that you're talking about this thing. So it makes it a lot more natural and a lot more passionate to be a part of this full time rather than I know a lot of people in university sports will only research one specific game or a few specific stats, whereas I'm looking at this full time, and I'm following every story sort of that's coming out of university sports to make sure that when I step on the broadcast, there's nobody who knows it better than I do.
And we talked about a range of your concentrations from U Sports to the OHL, a little bit of World Junior talk. What are some of the other opportunities, whether it's been a job or whether it's just been an assignment or an opportunity? What are some of the let's say the cooler things that you've had a chance to be a part of because of sport media?
So a lot of the stuff in my program doesn't exactly translate into necessarily industry experience. It's a lot of training and getting your reps in the academic program, but everything that I've done outside of it isn't a result of being a part of that Ryerson program. It's being who I am and chasing these opportunities. But I guess what are some other cool opportunities? I spent a lot of time
Yeah,
at the Nat Bailey.
that's kind of where the question was going. I kind of bungled up the wording, but yeah.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time at the Nat Bailey Stadium in Vancouver, covering the Vancouver Canadians for a couple blogs. I wrote for Fansided's Blue Jays blog a couple of years ago, covering the Vancouver Canadians over there. And I know Rob Fay, who also might be watching tonight, a good mentor of yours as well, was very welcoming to me at the Nat Bailey when he was doing play-by-play for the Seas. And I was covering that team, and that gave me a lot of experience as well. And Rob really helped me out in that. And there were also a bunch of other people who really helped me out in covering the Seas. And I was going through a bit of a tough time at that time as well. I was suffering from some mental illness issues, and that really gave me a reason to wake up every day was to cover baseball at the Nat Bailey. And I couldn't be happier seeing that they're going to be getting full season baseball now.
Yeah, Rob's been a really good friend of myself and a friend of the show. Of course, he was one of our first guests here. And yeah, I can speak from personal experience with Rob, how supportive he's been to myself, and I know to other young broadcasters and media types coming up. How important is that for somebody in positions like we might be in to have somebody who's who's a little more experienced and a little more established in the business? How important is that to learn from those people and to have those people be willing to lend a hand?
I think it's so important. I wouldn't be where I am today without having people lend a hand to me, whether it's a local sports reporter in Vancouver, a play-by-play guy here, a play-by-play guy there, or a major national hockey insider helping me out. Because a lot of the things I just wouldn't know what to do. I think I would bungle a lot of things up if it was just up to myself. But sometimes I do need to call someone just to make sure I know what I'm doing, and just to make sure that I'm doing everything right and everything in a way that's telling the story possible and in the best way possible. So I know when I was breaking a lot of the U Sports stuff over the summer, I called a couple of people just to make sure I was doing this in the most responsible way. And I've had some hiccups. I've had some people maybe not too pleased with what I've reported, but I definitely learned from that. And I think I would not be where I am today without the help of people who have sort of quote unquote made it in the industry.
Yeah, and that's that's a good point that you bring up. Is there any light you can shed on anything like that where something you've reported has received a little bit of pushback? And I guess where I'm going with that is, how do you respond to that?
So I report what I know. I don't report things unless it's multiple sources and where I know I don't report things that aren't true. So when something goes up on my Twitter, I've heard it from somewhere reliable that it's going to be true. Um, but some people don't necessarily want to accept that. I've had a few people get frustrated with me for saying season's not canceled or something along those lines. But I report what I hear on, and if I'm proven right, that certainly puts a better brand on my name. And I haven't been wrong yet.
Yeah. Um, Sorry, just looking, just checking something. Yeah, and one thing we haven't touched on yet was you have a little bit of experience as well reporting on the National Lacrosse League as a reporter for Toronto and Vancouver in the NLL. What's that experience like in the NLL?
I love lacrosse. It's an amazing sport. It's the national sport of Canada. And I think some of the stories that you find in lacrosse are some of the richest stories that you can find really in any sport, save for maybe soccer, with just the First Nation aspect in lacrosse, as well as Americans who have sort of picked up the game. There's so many stories that you can find, especially in box lacrosse, and it's been amazing to sort of learn the sport, cover the sport, and get to know some of the athletes as well, and the stories that sort of make them up, because they're not your average NHL player making $2 million a year. These guys all have second jobs. They're all teachers. They're all firefighters, and they'll fly wherever they need to be to play lacrosse on the weekends. So there's just something a bit more personable, and something that's just a little bit more interesting about covering the National Lacrosse League, because it gets all the lights and glamour on game day, but the guys are certainly not the same people as you would see in any other sport.
It's got a lot of similarities to it where um, they're not making the big money, and they get the attention on game day, but it's not. There's nothing on the same stature as any of the mainstream professional sports. So there's a lot of tie-ins there to what we we're talking about earlier with the Olympic athletes.
Yeah, it's a lot of the same sort of thing where these guys just don't get the public interest unless something significant is happening. So if a team is making the final, sure, people will pack the Scotiabank Arena or Rogers Arena to support the Warriors and the Rock. But if they're not, then nobody really cares all that much, especially in these times. It used to be that people cared a lot and they would pack Maple Leaf Gardens for the Toronto Rock, but it just doesn't happen anymore. And the same thing with the Olympics. Other than every 4 years when a gold medal's on the line and you get to play your country's national anthem if you win, people just don't care, and it's unfortunate. I think these sports clearly have an interest every 4 years. There's just a bit of an issue in maybe how they're marketed, and I think probably how the stories are told of these athletes, because clearly there's an interest when everybody puts money into it every year, or every 4 years, and so if there was that same effort put in, I think the same result would come, and you'd have a bunch more people following these Olympic sports.
And I think there's another sport that you've been around that I think perception is a big part of it. Is youth sports hockey. Of course, they usually play pre-tournament games with Canada's World Junior team, and that didn't happen this year due to Canada having a bout with COVID in their selection camp. But U Sport hockey really doesn't get really much of any attention on the mainstream level, and even talking to people that dive into the CHL, U Sport is kind of thought of like, it's pretty much an afterthought. But when you look at the rosters of U Sport teams, full of former CHL All Stars and Junior A All Stars, that's a really good product there.
I'm confident in saying that if you go to any U Sports game on any night, you're going to get a higher level of hockey on that ice than you would at any CHL arena in this country. Because the guys are older, they're faster, they're more experienced, and I think a lot of them are even smarter because they've experienced the game at such a high level for such a long time. U Sports hockey is entertaining, it's fast. There's really no good reason that people won't want to watch it, except that it's not the future. And I think Canadian fans, especially those who have grown up with junior hockey, like watching the 15-year-old who's going to be an all-star later in his career, because you can say that you saw him when he was 15, 16, 17, whereas you're not going to get that guy in esports hockey. Maybe you get one guy that sort of comes out of esports hockey Derek Ryan comes to mind, third liner on the Calgary Flames. He came out of the University of Alberta, but he's not an all-star. He's no Matthew Tkachuk. He's no Austin Matthews, who tore up the World Juniors. So there's a difference there, right? Because it's not the prospects, it's not the future of the game. And I think that's really what makes junior hockey so tantalizing, is watching the game's future.
Yeah, and how important is public perception to basically anything that we've talked about? We've talked about how, the CHL basically it's the king of amateur sports in Canada from a perception standpoint because of what you talked about. People dive into it because they want to see the stars before they're stars. But for some of the other sports that don't have an opportunity to push out the future star content that they can, how important is it for these different sports or teams or what have you to kind of create their own narrative, to try to do what they can to to improve that perception, to make it something that people want to pay attention to?
I think it is tough to create that sort of passionate aspect around university sport in Canada, because plain and simply, we don't have the sort of thing that exists in the US, where people have such a connection to their alma maters that they raise their kids in the UBC Thunderbirds colors, say, or I guess you use Wisconsin Badgers, for example. They've got a massive fan base. If a grandparent went to the University of Wisconsin, then the kid grew up and the kid had a kid, all as University of Wisconsin fans. So then you create that sort of passionate fan base as you have in the States. It's just not like that in Canada. And barring a massive, massive overhaul of all of university sport, it's never going to happen. And even if it were to start to happen, it would take 60 years to really make that difference, because it is that family connection which drives the US university sports. And in Canada, there's not that. It's going to take a while to build that. And there's also a perception that our sports aren't as good as the US, which is also something that needs to change. And I think there are some schools that are changing that. You look at the Carleton University men's basketball team. They regularly beat NCAA teams. They're one of the best teams in Canada. But then you can also take a look in that same conference, and you have Ontario Tech, who's brand new, and they have won one game. So like, there's not that consistent level of greatness that maybe there is in the NCAA.
Yeah, and talking to Ben Steiner here on Behind the Mic, and we'll get out of here in a few minutes, as I know people's time is valuable tonight. Of course, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to everybody tuning into our first live episode. As we start to wrap it up a little bit, and we've touched on a lot of things, but give us a little wrap up on where we can find your work.
So you can find my work at a fair number of places. I guess the most centralized would be my Twitter. I post everything that I do and report on there. That's at Ben Steiner 00, 00, just for my birth year in 2000. So at Ben Steiner 00. And I think if you follow Jonathan on Twitter as well, there's a connection to me there, so you can find me pretty easily. But you can also find a lot of my work on kingstonfrontenacs.com and alpinecanada.org.
Sweet, and we'll keep pumping out your content when I see it. It'll be on my page, Hot G Speaks, as well. We've been talking, you and I, we've been talking for a little while, trying to line up a show, and thrilled that it finally worked out for you to come on. Tons of fun. Thanks so much for spending a little bit of time with us. I know it was fun for me, and I learned something from talking to you this week in the lead up to the show, and I know our listeners will as well. So appreciate you coming on. Thanks.
I'm very happy to come on, and if you ever need somebody to come on anytime else, I'm only a message or a call away. So happy to talk amateur sport. It's definitely one of my passions and my beat, and really where I'm trying to build my career.
Appreciate that. Well, we're gonna wrap it up, and we're gonna go to a break here and come back with our wrap up. But as we say goodbye to Ben here in a second, we're gonna play Ben off with a clip of his hockey play-by-play work at Ryerson. We'll be right back here on Behind the Mic on ASTV.
Riley up to Mowbray. Mowbray shot, goal. Pops the bottle, Alex Mowbray, and it's 3-2 power play goal for York. There, here's Miller, open space. Miller shoots, he scores. Miller.
And back here for the wrap up on Behind the Mic on Amateur Sports TV. Jonathan Hodson with you here. Just done a chat with Ben Steiner from a number of places, 49 Sport, covering U Sports and Canadians in the NCAA, as well as the Kingston Frontenacs and Alpine Canada. A lot of good stuff came up in our chat today, talking about different sports and how they're doing in the face of what's been a challenging 2020 year. But we have something to look forward to as the World Juniors have kicked off, and we'll take it straight through early January. Couple of games already in the books today, and Canada starting off tomorrow. And so we'll keep an eye on that, and I'm sure we'll have an update on that next week. We'll be back with you next week again. We go every Friday night, 5 Pacific and 8 Eastern, across the ASTV network, amateursport.tv, as well as Facebook, YouTube, and our Periscope page. And so once again, we want to thank Ben Steiner for coming on and spending some time with us and allowing us to get to know him and his career. And it was a lot of fun, and I know I had a lot of fun and learned something. So we're gonna sign off. But once again, thanks so much for spending part of your Friday night with us. One more time, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and we'll talk to you again next Friday with a chat with another sportscaster. We'll talk to you later.